Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Delightful, and it's always an honor to have Mark Stahlman back. So Mark, what are we talking about today?
Thank you again, Shrikant. This has been really a wonderful treat to me, Bill Frezza, Peter Berkman, Adam Pugin, and the others from the Center for the Study of Digital Life who've had an opportunity to attend here. This will probably be the last in this current series of what I'm doing, at least. Although I'm hoping to see you more later in the future. Today we're going to talk about an essay that I wrote in a somewhat different style from what we've been discussing to date in the journal of the center. The journal is called Dianoetikon. That is, as you'll no doubt recognize, a Greek word. It roughly translates into thinking things through. So we've called this journal Dianoetikon a practical journal, in our view that thinking things through is about as practical as you can get. In that you will find, in addition to a fairly lengthy introduction explaining what we're doing, you'll find my essay on the inner senses in human engineering. You'll find Peter's essay on inner senses and the McLuhans. And you'll find Adam's excellent essay dealing with various modern psychologists. Magda Arnold, probably most importantly. What a shock it was for me to learn that Shrikant had actually discovered Magna. She's quite obscure, although there's a fascinating oral history that she recorded. I don't know if you found that, Shrikant, but there's an oral history of her online. I will try to find the link for it and send it to you.
Please.
I probably shouldn't stop what I'm doing though and locate it for the purpose of chat, but she was a pioneering female psychologist, and so it was from the feminist direction that they decided to record her history, which was really quite remarkable. In particular, her husband abandoned her at the University of Toronto, but as a faculty wife, she was able to study, and that's how that all began. In addition to her Jesuit boyfriend, in air quotes, who helped her along the way. It's quite a remarkable story. There's also a PhD that was recently written, I think maybe a master's, but I think a PhD written about her life. So there's some fascinating biographical material. So in addition to Magda Arnold, he also, Adam talks about Jordan Peterson and Vervenke, both psychologists at Toronto, where she began. So that seems to be the center of this particular vortex. So I encourage all of you to take a look at those essays. What we're going to do today is a little bit different. In particular, Shrikant's agreed to add an opinion poll at the beginning of this, as well as I have I've taken the cover photographs from a series of books, and we'll go through those one by one, and hopefully this will all fit well within the time, give us plenty of opportunity for breakout, lots of opportunity for discussion afterwards. So I want to remind you that I'm a retired Wall Street analyst. I'm not a public intellectual. I don't write and publish books on these subjects. I read a lot of them, and I have conversations with many people. But my background is basically as a biologist. And coming from a biological direction, it will not surprise you that when I first walked into Julian Jaynes's office at Princeton, I don't think I've told Brian this story. I walked in with the mistaken notion that what he was describing was an evolution of consciousness. He was not. he was actually angry with me within 5 minutes of walking in the door for using that language about it. Perhaps at some point we'll have a chance, maybe even in this discussion today, to tease out that very important comment by James and contrast it maybe even in some sense with the use of evolution in the title of Merlin Donald's book. So there's a disconnect of an important sort there. But as a evolutionary biologist, I studied what was available. I know that a lot has happened since, and I've tried to keep track with all of this. But we're sort of caught now in the crosshairs in a very very deliberate and I think very heightened fashion, as is shown in the headlines virtually every day, typically falling under the heading of culture wars, but it's far, far deeper than that. And the question here is whether we're on a cusp of building a radically better world. And there's a massive portion of the population who believes that that's exactly what is needed at this point. And there's also a portion of the population who doesn't think that makes much sense at all. And so therefore, we're kind of caught in this, what I think is actually an end game, not the beginning, but really the end of a century-plus long phenomenon of trying to engineer human beings. So those who have taken the attitude that the world has gone to hell in a handbasket, and the only way that we can get out of this is effectively to engineer a new species, has now gone so far, we won't discuss this in any length today, but I will just note for you that philosophy departments around the world are really very drawn to the topic of something that they call post-humanity. Post-humanism is very much a hot topic. There are conferences being held around the world. It probably is the single most exciting new topic in philosophy, from what I'm being told. And so the question arises, what on earth are these people talking about at precisely the time when we are spending billions of dollars trying to animate dead matter in the form of computers and turning them into artificial humans? And at precisely the point when a fascinating document appeared this past week. Title of the document is the final report of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Again, that is beyond the scope of exactly what we're going to talk about today, although we may deal with some questions about that later on. So right at the moment when humanity believes, or many humans believe, that we can actually design a completely new entity, which we will endow with rights. Robot rights are a very serious matter in many places nowadays. At exactly this point, philosophy has also adopted this view that we're going post-human. And so all of this winds up, I think, being very much caught in the topic of human engineering. So Shrikant, maybe this is a good time to throw up the poll.
Perfect. So folks, this is a short poll. I'm going to relaunch it. Go ahead and vote. There are 4 questions. You can go ahead and select your answers and then just say send or okay. So there are 25 people. So go ahead and vote, please. We've got 1 vote. And as soon as we're done, all of us will see the results together, so we know where we are. Okay, we are up to 10. Okay, 13. I'm going to give you another maybe 30 seconds to finish because I would like to see as many responses as possible. Maritza, you just come in. Can you go ahead and vote in the poll? All right, we are up to 17. Okay, last 15 seconds for people to send your votes in. Okay, we are up to 19. Okay, I think that is good. So I'm going to go ahead and share the results. Last chance. Okay. And poll. Okay, just a second. Why is it not ending? Give me a second. Okay, there. Share results. There. All right. Mark, could you go ahead and read out the results and interpret them and comment on them?
Sure, thank you. First question, and I'll apologize ahead of time. I am far too liberal in my use of quotes, and so nearly every sentence that I write seems to have something in quotes. The implication there is that these are complicated terms that have many different meanings. The first question is, do you believe there is an inherent human nature? 100% yes. Second question is, this is a very critical point, by the way, number one, as you will see when we get in through the rest of the materials. Number two, is that nature, in quote, good or bad? Here we had, fascinatingly, 35% answer the question good. Nobody answering the question as bad. So we have a linkage here between the inherent human nature. Nobody on this particular discussion believes that inherent nature is bad. 65%, 2/3, believe that it is neither. That would imply, of course, a general belief within this group of free will, that we actually have a choice between good and bad, good and evil. Question number 3 really gets to the core of what we're going to discuss today. Can human nature, which everyone has agreed is already inherent, can it, in quotes, evolve while still remaining human? This would seem to contradict the inherent human nature answer of the first question, but that's fine. People often hold, if not fully contradictory, at least opinions that are complicated in relationship to each other. So the answer to this is yes, 80%. No, 20%. So I would say that for the first 3 questions, we've had an overwhelming plurality beyond a majority of this group. And here we get to the final question, which is really the key one here. You notice I didn't ask for people's political party affiliations. I didn't ask for who you voted for in the election. I'm not sure that question number 4 tells us much about that, but it reads, would we live in a better world, in quote, if we could direct that evolution? Split right down the middle, 50-50. I'm not surprised really at any of these answers, including potential internal contradictions amongst them. So please keep that in mind as we go through this discussion. I think maybe it's a good time to put up the first cover.
Yes.
So this will be a series of comments, almost footnotes, on a series of book covers, which are highlighted in the essay, which I have written for Dianoeticon. Instead of going through paragraph by paragraph and so forth, the essay, which I think we probably should do another time, maybe in this format, maybe someplace else. Let me begin with what I think is really a critical tone-setting book written by a man who is probably completely obscure to this group, but in his time, he was very well known because he was a senior Rockefeller Foundation executive. So the reason why Lawrence K. Frank, or Larry Frank, is an important figure, most likely, is because he had money. Not just any old kind of money, but Rockefeller money. And for those of you who have dealt with the history of, in particular, the social sciences in the 20th century, you'll recognize that overwhelmingly, the money that was spent to establish and pursue those social sciences, sociology, anthropology, psychology, even history, linguistics, and beyond, that money overwhelmingly came from Rockefeller pockets. What happened after World War II was that the Ford Foundation took over that responsibility. And you might imagine, therefore, that somehow or other the torch had passed and that somebody else was now in charge. Not true. Henry Ford died. Edsel Ford died. They owned the majority of the Ford Motor Company stock. The accountants and lawyers naturally advised them that they could pay inheritance tax effectively on the entire Ford Motor Company, and in the process have to sell stock in order to pay the taxes and lose control of Ford. Their option was to put that money into a foundation. And so shortly after this book, Nature and Human Nature, appeared from the Rockefeller camp, a new Ford Foundation with more money than anybody else at the time. And I will just footnote here that for what it is worth, the Gates Foundation is today's rough equivalent of the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, including their political objectives. So you see Bill Gates in the news. You might wonder why. This retired computer executive, who most people have forgotten about, is suddenly front page news again. It's because of that foundation position, their role in medicine in particular. What Larry Frank proposes in this book is that human nature is not in any way inherent. So Larry Frank is flat out disagreeing with 100% of everybody. We didn't have a chance to discuss what I meant by that, and so my guess is that many people would, based on the other answers that they gave, they would head off in different directions at this point. But his view was that we have made a breakthrough, that the 20th century represents a fundamental departure from previous human nature, because now it is in our hands to craft the kind of human nature that we want to have. So this, for me, is even though it had been going on for many, many decades before that, I sort of take the break of World War II as the accelerant that shifted all of this, because of course the concerns over our enemies, the axis of evil in World War II, put two of the more literate, developed civilizations, Germany and Japan, along with others, which you might place someplace else along that scale. They went hardcore evil, as the story would go. And what happened is the Rockefeller Foundation, actually Rockefeller Brothers Fund, launched something in the late 1930s called the Radio Research Project to try to get at the causality. Is it possible that radio has turned these otherwise literate? So here we have a contrast between print and electric media, as we've described it in previous sessions. Is this really what caused this to happen? Did something fundamentally go wrong in our environment, the Rockefellers asked? Their answer, of course, was yes. There's something, this radio thing is wrong on many levels. What they decided to do on many different fronts was to then pursue the opportunity to re-engineer humans, effectively taking what radio had done and then trying to reverse it. So after World War II, we got into a situation where there was an enormous amount of money, an enormous number of smart people, and I want to emphasize this throughout. I am not suggesting that these were what any of us would identify as evil people. In fact, the 50-50 answer, the last one of the poll, would indicate that many of us, and I'm sure every one of us looks in the mirror every day and says, I'm a good person, that many of us would imagine trying to fundamentally change or alter human nature in order to make a better world. It would be very strange if this audience that Shrikant has assembled didn't have a roughly 50-50 split on that question. Larry Frank winds up with a very interesting career. We'll move on to the next item in just a second, but just to finish with Larry. Larry's final act before he expired was to organize something called, this is 1967. He organized a very elaborate effort funded by the American Academy of Science, AAAS. And the title of this was Towards the Year 2000. So 67 was 33 years away from 2000. I was alive in 67. 67 was a very rambunctious year, by all accounts. I was actually just listening last night to some songs written by Neil Young in Topanga Canyon in California in 1967. I'm an old man, so that's sort of the music I grew up with. But 67, as you recall, we're heading into a period of assassinations. We're heading into a very contentious 68 election, and so forth. So in that time period, in 67 and from beyond, and beyond that, we had an acceleration of an enormous series of these efforts to re-engineer human nature in order to build a better world. I guess it's up to me to click to the next one, right?
No, I can go through. I'll go to the next one whenever you're ready.
Okay, next one, thank you. Once again, we're dealing with obscurity here that should not probably be so obscure. And so I'm thankful for the opportunity to go through some of these books. I'll be somewhat quicker as I go through them one after another. This is another very obscure author. He's Dutch. If you look up his Wikipedia page, he will be described as one of the very first futurists in the world. He became a government official in the Netherlands. And he wrote this book, The Image of the Future. This is the second of the English translations, which I'll describe in a minute how we got to this. But he wrote the original in Dutch in 1953. So you're catching here the timing of what's going on here. Coming out of World War II, the concern that we really needed to re-engineer society, by and large, with an enormous amount of money and social science committed to doing it, located this fellow. Now, in 1954, the year after this book was first published, this specific second translation doesn't appear until the 1980s. But the original of this in Dutch becomes a very important document for the very first instance of something called the Center for the Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences. That may also be obscure, but for anybody who is in the social sciences, it's an extremely well-known and highly prestigious, to this day, place where people tend to take their sabbaticals. It was initially funded by the Ford Foundation. The people who I just described to you had taken over from the Rockefellers. So first slide here was Rockefeller Foundation, Larry Frank. Second slide here is Ford Foundation. At a group at Stanford University, sometimes pronounced CASBA. CISBS are the initials for this outfit. And you will find, if you do research in social science, you will find to this date people who are associated with the Casbah. One of my personal friends, John Markon, who for a long time was the chief technology writer, particularly in Silicon Valley for the New York Times. He's now retired from the Times, but he has been associated with the Casbah for many years now, in part for writing the authorized biography of Stuart Brand, the fellow who gave us The Whole Earth and so forth. The interesting part about the book title you have in front of you, or a couple of the interesting parts you have here, but you cannot see yes, you do see. So you see in blue beneath here, translated and abridged by Elise Goulding. Elise Goulding is probably also somewhat obscure, but it turns out that she and her husband, Kenneth, you'll see more about Kenneth in a minute. Elise and Kenneth bunked with Fred Pollock at Stanford in 1954 for the first edition of the Casbah. And this was really, at that time, probably much less true today, even though it still is a very high honor to be invited to be a fellow there. But at this time in the 50s, this was sort of ground central for how are we going to change society, or as I sometimes reference it using the television tagline, save the cheerleader, save the world. These people were very much cheerleaders, and these were not nasty people. These were very kind people. Elise and her husband were Oxford-trained Quaker mystics. These were the same people who brought us peace studies, conflict resolution studies. In social science terms, these were among the most pure, if you will. Their view was that we could invent something new that would shift evolution, as you'll see in the next few slides. But I'm highlighting here for the moment that this second translation abridgment, there is a full version as well that I did not include on this list, that Elise did, that appeared in the 1960s. She learned Dutch, so she could do these translations. In the 1960s, she published the full version. This is the abridged version. Very importantly, the abridged version contains every single chapter except one. You have to go through the table of contents and compare them side by side. But Elise decided in her final treatment of this, which is the only one that most people have ever seen, the original 2-volume English translation goes for today. If you can find a copy, many hundreds of bucks. Most people don't have them. This one got wide circulation from Elsevier. The chapter that is missing is the chapter that Fred Pollock called the futureless future. Elise was not willing to continue with that theme because she was so absolutely committed to shaping evolution in a positive, favorable fashion, saving the cheerleader, so to speak, that she left that entire chapter out. Let's look at the next book title, Shrikant. Thank you. So this one, as you see, is her husband, Kenneth. And this is published in '56, I believe, and it is a direct result of that summer in Stanford. And this is a fascinating book. As with all the rest, I encourage those of you who want to pursue your own independent research on this to take a look. But what you see here is a kind of a Rorschach-y sort of a psychological ink blot in the middle of it, and this very portentous or pretentious, perhaps, knowledge in life and society, the image. So what came out of Fred Pollock's The Image of the Future was this commitment to provide humanity with a new image of the future, because Christianity had collapsed. There was no longer a heaven and a hell as the future for each of us individually. And removing that future Fred Pollock believed is why we had a futureless future. So here's Kenneth Boulding, smack on top of the event at Stanford, publishing a book which then spins off a half a dozen other versions. But I'll just note for you that in this book he designs a completely new science to deal with the topic of images. I don't probably need to emphasize to you that we are now in the age of television. And the idea that people under television conditions would think that the image, and in turn, the imagination, would be paramount should not surprise you at all. Our theme throughout all of these discussions has been that we tend to conform to the underlying media environment in which we live. And if that media environment is a radio one, well, the image would not be the most obvious book to write. On the other hand, if it's television, we've got all kinds of images that we can start worrying about. And what Ken did here is that he invented the science of iconics, spelling it in the scholarly fashion with an E, E-I-C-O-N, iconics. I'm sure many of you know about the history of icons in various religious contexts and iconoclasm as well, fighting over idolatry. Here we have a devout Quaker mystic proposing to us that we invent new idols. And this is his replacement for Christianity. Quakerism is a very curious departure from the Church of England. I won't belabor this. Many of you may be familiar with an even more radical departure known as the Shakers. The Shakers established themselves nearby where I was a couple weekends ago, up in Lenox, Massachusetts. So if you get up in that area, you may get a chance to visit their museum. Fascinating group who believed that having children is an evil activity and completely destructive to our purity as humans, very much believing that human nature was bad. So that question where nobody answered bad, the Shakers answered bad. And so as a result, since this was agricultural time period and the Shakers themselves didn't want to do the work, somebody had to till the field. So they would go to local orphanages and kidnap babies. And so that wonderful simplistic furniture that you're all familiar with from the Shakers, that is ultimately the result of a very bizarre cult. And idolatry would have absolutely terrified them. Here we have Ken Boulding promoting idolatry in the image, promoting iconics. Now, it may be notable that it wasn't for another 20 years, 1976, when someone was able to publish a name for what Kenneth Boulding was recommending. And that name, of course, is mimetics. So Richard Dawkins, in his 1976, The Selfish Gene, proposes the term mimetics, but it had been bouncing around for 20 years before that, with Ken Boulding attempting to turn us all into effectively those people in Plato's cave, staring at the flicking images. Could we have the next one, please, Shrikant? Thank you. My guess is that some of you are well enough read in the broad field of that we're now talking about, the intersection between social science and what happened in the 50s and 60s, particularly in the 60s. And so this book may be somewhat more familiar to you, as well as the author. O.W. Markley is superior in the hierarchy at Stanford Research Institute to Willis Harman, but Harman is really the man behind all of this. And if you haven't taken a look at this to see sort of what has brought us to today, a full version of this, many versions of this are available on the net. It's considered probably one of the most infamous treatments of these subjects in that time period. Initially funded by the Department of Education, which was only established in the US government in the 1960s. This circulated as a private manuscript amongst many collaborators over the course of a decade or more, and was eventually published, I think, in the early 1980s. But throughout the 70s, so the predicates for this were all laid down in the 60s. Throughout the 70s, there were probably a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people who had mimeographed copies in circulation before it was finally published. But when you take a look at this and consider it in the context of larger history, it may jump out at you how bold a plan this actually was. The view was, of course, that there is no inherent human nature, taking us back to Larry Frank, who had published 20 years before this, coming out of World War II. The point was that we can change the image of man. We can pretty much dial in whatever we'd like. And so let's take this thing out, put a leash on it, and take it for a walk around the block. And you will find virtually every one of the significant futurists of the time as a part of a group who approved this document. This is not a single author document, but rather a committee wrote this document. Some very, very big names, Rene Dubois and many of the early futurists wrote this. You will also find in this an appendix accusing those who wrote this group committee document of being too conservative, too reluctant. And the accelerated version of this is in an appendix written by Elise Boulding, once again, the woman who translated Fred Popek. Let's look at the next one, Srikanth. This book, which has been published over and over again with the single author, Willis Harman, may be better known, perhaps, than the other texts which I've been showing you. The New Age Revolution in the Way We Think. So this is, at a certain point, you get tired of simply telling people that you can engineer humans to be something different than what they were before. You have to start laying out what the details are going to be. So I read this book as Willis Harman's attempt to lay down all of the basic outlines of what this new change is going to be. This change, of course, is one that you're all familiar with. It's right there in the subtitle to all of this. Let's look at the next one, Srikanth. How many of you actually had a chance to read this when it first came out in 1978? So Marilyn Ferguson got the, I've been told by many people who are involved with this. And so a part of what I have done with this research is not to just go to the library and read the book and then try to draw connections between them. It will not surprise you to hear that I have gone out of my way to actually try to meet some of the people involved with all of this and to interview them at some length about how this came apart. I had published something which could have been interpreted negatively on a mailing list a very long time ago, somewhere lost in the mists of posts that nobody even keeps track of anymore. Something that could have been interpreted negatively about the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, which is, as you probably know, is a think tank, largely government funded, military funded, located in Menlo Park, right next to the Stanford campus. And I got a reply. And the reply came back to me from a fellow who said that it was his job to make sure that people didn't say bad things about SRI. And my implications about Willis Harman, who had worked at SRI, and in particular had been deeply involved in the early LSD revolution at SRI, that I was obviously completely wrong about that. And I was then a Wall Street analyst traveling back and forth to Silicon Valley. So I wound up at breakfast at the high-end restaurant, Il Fornaio, in Palo Alto with Tom. Tom was a fellow from SRI, and as we were going through breakfast, he had the experience that I was, for some reason, unusually well-informed about the topic of LSD and its various institutional connections and so forth. And he got it into his head that I had somehow come from a higher power. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced that with anybody you've come in touch with, but you bump into somebody, you thought you spent your entire life on something, and all of a sudden somebody drops into your life, and they seem to be almost supernaturally informed. So as we're walking out of breakfast, Tom grabbed my sleeve. He said, "Mark, I'm about to die." He, in fact, had 2 months left to live. He said, "I want some of the good LSD. I want some of the LSD that Sandoz made. I want the LSD that Aldous Huxley had his wife inject him with when he was dying. Could you please get me some of that? And oh, by the way, I want you to get in your car and drive to Sausalito to meet Willis Harman." That's to say, the author of the previous 2 books that I just showed you. My response to Tom, of course, was, Willis Harman is not going to interrupt his busy day to have a chat with me. Thank you very much, Tom, but I don't think that's going to work. Tom just looked me in the eye and said, "Don't worry about it. I'll make sure it happens. Get in your car and drive to Sausalito." Well, Palo Alto to Sausalito is a bit of a hike for those of you who've done that. But for some reason, I believed Tom. And I got in my car after breakfast, drove up to Sausalito. Lo and behold, Willis Harman was right there on the balcony. Their residence then at something called the Institute Institute of Noetic Science. So that abbreviates to INOS. I'm sorry, IONANS, ions. And Willis Harman spent the rest of the day trying to explain to me what had really gone on here. It turns out what had really gone on here is that they had been told by an angel that they were covered in their attempts to change evolution, and that in fact LSD was what the angel had called a previous sacrament of the Catholic Church, and that this was going to be the way that society was going to change. Once and for all, we're going to save the cheerleader. Now, it's quite possible for me to make stories like this up. I've met a number of people who knew Tom and Willis Harman, and they've all told me that sounds like exactly the way they would approach these problems at this point. And out of that entire nexus, we wind up with Marilyn Ferguson, who gets the assignment for the popular version of this, which of course is the founding manifesto of what we come to call the New Age. Fast forward to today, the person who probably has been the most effective over the course of the last few decades in promoting the New Age is Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey, of course, attempted to start her own television network, the Oprah Winfrey Network, OWN, OWN. That failed, but don't worry, everything's fine. She now has taken over CBS. So the CBS television network is run by the Aquarian Conspiracy. And tonight at 8 p.m., you'll all get a chance to hear Oprah Winfrey interviewing the royal family. So talk about history all coming into collision. I think this is likely to be a fascinating interview. This ends the section of these covers, which have to do with the birthing and organizing and some of my involvement with the people for what we come to know as the New Age. New Age, you would think, is either harmless or well-meaning or spiritual. In fact, it was an attempt to destroy everything. In fact, these very well-meaning, very nice personally, very intelligent and very capable people were doing their version of what Hitler had done under radio conditions. The New Age is the television version of the attempt to engineer humanity that previously had its examples, typically today under the heading of fascism. I'll note for you also, the title isn't here, but if you wish to see a detailed treatment of how fascism turned from what everybody today, of course, has no option but to hate, into the Aquarian conspiracy. The title of that book is called Friendly Fascism. The author's name is Bertrand Gross. He comes from a fascinating outfit called Tavistock, which I won't bore you with the details of anymore at this point. But let's now back up versions of this with a few other covers. Theodor Adorno is a name that is quite well known within left-wing circles. He was one of the leading lights of the Frankfurt School. I would guess today, because so many right-wing polemicists in culture war terms have tried to identify cultural Marxism as the source of all errors, and they then trace that to the Frankfurt School. It might very well be that right-wing ideologues know who Theodor Adorno is now, although Herbert Marcuse tends to get most of the blame. All of that, like the rest of culture wars, from our standpoint, is rear view mirror, to use the Marshall McLuhan term. We're not engaged in any of that because, in fact, the world has moved on. The question now has become, culturally, what are we going to do with these robots? And there's a left wing and a right wing in terms of that, as there always is, two sides of the coin. Adorno, as it turns out, had been hired to the Rockefeller Radio Research Project, which was based out of Columbia University. Taking us back to the very first slide with Larry Frank, it turns out that he got in a fight with the man who had organized this, because Paul Lazarsfeld at Columbia University, who was known as the father of statistical sociology, wanted to develop all of this in a statistical fashion. The Marxist Theodor Adorno from Frankfurt instead wanted to carry it out in a critical fashion, which is the Dialectics of Enlightenment is one of the books that he wrote, for instance. So he wanted to do it really quite differently. On his way out the door, he got fired in the process. This is his second act, so to speak, by the same people, by the way. Rockefeller's paid for this one also. But on his way out the door, he wrote a 260-page memo to Lazarsfeld, which, as best I can tell, has never really been carefully analyzed. There's a vast group of academics who are very interested in Adorno, as you might imagine. The only copy that I'm aware of that exists of that memo from Adorno to Lazarsfeld is on a 35 millimeter microfilm at the Columbia Rare Books collection. I did go in there one day and take photographs on my iPhone of every page of that, until the only 35 millimeter microfilm reader they had broke. So I think I'm missing some of the last chapter, but one of these days I'm going to dig all that up and maybe find the leisure time to write about it. The basic point of the authoritarian personality is, if you believe you actually know anything, you're a fascist. This is a manifesto for what became the post-World War II social psychology field. I'll just note for you in passing that it was the social psychologist that my godfather Norbert Wiener refused to work with. I never got a chance to meet Wiener. I do not know how much he really knew about what these folks were trying to accomplish. His colleague, my other godfather, the historian of science, Giorgio de Santayana, published an item in which these folks were described as emotional engineers. I've condensed that a bit and simply called them human engineers. But the goal of this book and of the larger field associated with it was to tear down effectively all outstanding expertise. Anybody who wasn't with the program, by asserting the fact that they had clear knowledge, that they had academic standing, that they had real research and knowledge about this, was then graded on what Adorno called the F scale. We probably would have many other ways that we would decode the F scale nowadays. Of course, when this was published in 1951, it was the fascist scale. So if you actually claim to know something, in particular something these people don't, this was a very bold effort to effectively pull the rug out from underneath everybody. It has later been, in its specifics, challenged. I think it's important to note that none of these things persist endlessly in their expression, their final expression, but the underlying orientation, the motivation associated with this then winds up being retreaded, often with a new cover. I should also have mentioned to you, before we get to the next couple of slides here, that in addition to funding the Center for the Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences, the Ford money also wound up financing a few other interesting activities. So this isn't just social psychology. This isn't just F scales. This isn't just whatever you thought you knew, you don't really know it, because we're going to save the cheerleader and save the world. In fact, two other very important activities, there probably are others I'm unaware of, but two important activities were also financed by the same people. The first of them was Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan got a $43,000 grant from the Ford Foundation, and that translates into roughly $500,000 in today's money, in order to study changing behavior in new media environments. That sounds straightforward for Ford to finance that. Well, the new media environment in 1953, of course, was television. And the changing behaviors were exactly the question that had been posed by the Rockefellers in their radio project. So one way to interpret Marshall McLuhan's career, since he was just an English professor at the University of Toronto before any of this happened, is that all of this is an appendix to the Rockefellers' effort to understand radio. And then, of course, it exploded into so much else, including the Center for the Study of Digital Life. Funny how this works. In the midst of which my godfather was trying to fight against these guys. And so it turns out to be a truly remarkably small world. Next title, please, Shrikant. Thank you. I was very sad to learn that this book is no longer in its original print, because it is a very important one. I also met Chris Simpson. I wound up at DuPont Circle one day at a bookstore where we had arranged to meet, had a fascinating conversation. What Chris Simpson has done here is he has mapped person by person, dollar by dollar, the origins of communications research in World War II psychological warfare. So I don't attempt to present a history of psychological warfare in my essay. There's a lot of interesting material out there that can be read about that. But the simple outline is that following the launching of experimental psychology, which completely knocked the legs out from underneath the faculty psychology, which we are now trying to retrieve, as that got into the early 20th century, it naturally began to be employed in warfare. And so arguably the first concerted effort to organize psychological warfare occurred during World War I. One small anecdote in this, because I have spent a lot of time studying H.G. Wells, it turns out that Wells was hired to generate what today we would call the meme or the icon of the Germans being Huns. Now that seems quite bizarre in a world in which many Dr. Seuss books won't be published anymore for their offensive characters. But describing to the English population their enemy, the Germans, as Huns, was a very effective propaganda technique. And H.G. Wells supposedly was hired by the head of Fleet Street, Lord Beaverbrook, to accomplish that. So this is one of a handful of books. There's been a number of others written about early Cold War, so forth, which I would highly recommend to you. Not sure if a PDF is available online, but I should probably look for that. Next book cover, please. My guess is that there's some science fiction aficionados on this call. My guess is that there are some people here who differentiate amongst early, middle, and late, and maybe cyberpunk gets thrown into the middle of that, and so forth. I remember quite vividly the day when I walked into the large Barnes and Nobles, 5-story Barnes and Noble on Union Square, and on the first floor, close to the cash registers, the science fiction section used to be there. So right across from the information desk, in fact. So I went to where I thought the science fiction was to see what the new releases might be, and it wasn't there anymore. So I went over to the information desk and say, what happened? Is there no more science fiction? Have we given up on that? The answer, of course, was we decided that was no longer a category by itself. It now is part of the category called fantasy. So if you go to the very back of the store, you'll see shelves and shelves of authors who are writing fantasy. And we decided that's where this stuff belongs. Well, Anthony Burgess wrote a lot of books. Some of them would classify as science fiction. But as you might well know, many of the authors in the 1950s had some knowledge about what was going on behind the scenes. This is the time period in which the CIA is experimenting with MKUltra, with LSD and many other drugs. There's lots of questions about truth serums. There's all kinds of questions about Manchurian candidates. This book comes out of that framework. I'm quite confident that Anthony Burgess had some connections. He himself was in British intelligence during his World War II service. So he would have known in much the way that an Ian Fleming would have known, so we could write the James Bond. There's a lot of material, excuse me, that is sort of spilling out of the secret world into all of this. So this work winds up being probably important mostly for us because Stanley Kubrick made a movie out of it. and Kubrick winds up becoming himself now a fascinating figure in the midst of all of this. There was a time in my life when I was collecting tape recorders, audio tape recorders. A part of the reason for that was that eBay was offering all sorts of old professional equipment, often at a penny or less on the dollar. So these things were cheap. Another part of the reason was I knew when I got tired of it, I could just sell it back on eBay, which ultimately I did. I threw all this stuff. I had 80 plus tape recorders, and I threw them all back with one. I retained one, but I threw them all back into the pond. But I wound up buying a very high-end, probably originally a $50,000 tape recorder called a Nagra D, the digital version of Nagra. It turns out that was the tape recorder used on the filming of Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, the last film done by Stanley Kubrick. And as a result of that, I got to know Stanley Kubrick's favorite sound man. And so you see that there's a pattern here of me taking advantage of whatever situation it is to strike up conversations and build some version of friendship. Well, it turns out that Stanley Kubrick, as many of you probably know, was probably more so than Anthony Burgess. One of these characters who knew a lot about what was going on, who read a lot of things from the background. Eyes Wide Shut is his ultimate conspiracy theory. I actually wrote a review of Eyes Wide Shut, and I did it under a pseudonym. Not exactly sure why, but film critic is not probably my forte. But the title of my review was Ears Wide Shut. Trying to transition this over to a McLuhan sort of framework. So what you see in A Clockwork Orange is the attempt to engineer humans. You wind up with the Droogs. You wind up ultimately with the villain being strapped in a chair with his eyelids propped open, drugged, forced to look at images, reminding us of Kenneth Boulding's book, The Image, and how the image can be used to reprogram, they thought, the human psyche. So this is an interesting touchstone along the way. So we're heading towards the conclusion here. Next book after this is a fascinating 1970s version of all of this. Walter Boart was an aging hippie, I guess you might say, famous to some people in New York for starting a publication called the East Village Other. He wound up actually being introduced to his wife by Timothy Leary at Millbrook. So Boart was a fairly big deal, and what he's trying to do here with Operation Mind Control is to leverage people's concerns that all this stuff that is going on. So just to be clear here, this was a bestseller. This is a bestseller over and over again. Why? People understood that something was being done to them. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know exactly who was doing it. It was a lot more comfortable then, as it is now, to imagine the problem with Facebook is that Zuckerberg has enough money already, and therefore we should grab Zuckerberg and shake him by his shoulders and tell him to do something good. It's a lot easier to imagine that rich guys are evil than social psychologists being evil. And so this was a bestseller taking advantage of an audience who were thinking that the CIA was out to brainwash them. The specifics here are that there was a battle in the intelligence community between human intelligence, spies, and signals intelligence. That battle came to a head in 1975, which is the immediate predecessor to this book being published, as well as another one, which I'll tell you about in a second. And the idea here was the CIA is out to control all of our minds. That nothing like that ever actually happened. The CIA, by and large, is a bumbling bureaucracy. At that time, staffed with some fairly wild and crazy cowboys. The idea that the CIA could ever have organized mind control is, of course, insane. But now we have the version of this book, Operation Mind Control, under the heading of QAnon. QAnon has recast Walter Boart as a video game. And so the whole QAnon conspiracy functions for its audience as a bestseller by trying to move you through various scenarios. You get points for figuring this out, figuring that out. The net of it is then and now. These are all attempts to take advantage of a very gullible audience. Next one, please. Well, for you science fiction readers out there, Philip K. Dick, of course, is a very important modern writer. This is the current cover of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the book that most of you will know as having been turned into the movie Blade Runner. Blade Runner winds up hinging around the fact Tyrell Corporation has figured out how to build artificial humans that don't themselves know that they're robots and cannot be easily detected. So you wind up with Harrison Ford, the Blade Runner, trying to track down these errant androids. This is very much the situation we now find ourselves in. We will have to find the resources within ourselves and more broadly in society to deal with what has just now been proposed to the United States government as a takeover. The committee that wrote the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence final report consists of Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, and a very curious outfit called In-Q-Tel, which is the intelligence community's interface to Silicon Valley and beyond. Not a single person who was involved with this has ever been or will ever be elected democratically to anything. And yet, you will find in the opening letter the entire reason why we must spend hundreds of billions of dollars on trying to duplicate the Tyrell Corporation effectively. Reason why we must do this, of course, is because our democratic values are being challenged. The irony of having people who don't have a democratic bone in their body promoting the idea of democracy so that they can get hundreds of billions of dollars from the US government, this really deserves a Saturday Night Live skit. I think I'll propose it to him. Next title, please. Some of you have probably seen the recent movie, The Social Dilemma, financed by Netflix. This is the book behind The Social Dilemma. So if you recall in that movie, you wind up with a fellow by the name of Tristan Harris. I probably haven't pronounced it emphatically enough. Tristan Harris, one-time ethicist at Google, now the head of the Center for Humane Technology. This is his Bible. This is a book written about television. It was written at Stanford about how television techniques can be extended into the internet. So this book is supposedly the description of how it is that Facebook and all the rest of these things work. Now, for the psychologists who are following the bouncing ball here, you may have heard about mirror neurons. You may have heard about dopamine releases. You may have heard about addiction. None of that is true. In fact, it is the technology itself which takes advantage of flaws or entry points into our subconscious. And so BJ Fogg would be my recommendation for how you might want to consider that. So this is the underlying text for all of what you've been told about how social media is now uniquely manipulating you. Fascinating. After a century of attempting to engineer humans, something seems to have happened in our lives so that it has now become admissible to expose the fact that the technologies are manipulating us. Merlin Donald, if you have followed his work, if you listened to his presentation last week, very strong presentation. I believe he'll be back with free count in the future, once dates can be agreed upon. You might have noticed Merlin going off on the topic of technology manipulating us. If you follow through to the 2012 lecture that Merlin gave in Sweden, you might have noticed that in Merlin's view, we have become toys in the face of these technologies. Did not take Facebook, did not take any of the rest of that for this to happen. This has been going on for a very long time now. And Merlin is quite correct. We have been toyed with. What unfortunately is missed in that analysis is the fact that we now have the capability of recognizing the pattern of being toyed with. So something has happened in our lives such that our pattern recognition now allows us to pay attention to these things. Next cover, please. Adam Curtis is a documentary filmmaker for the BBC. He has, as a result of that, very wide range of topics he can tackle. He's gotten a lot of attention, and so I think he probably gets the resources that he needs. Of all the documentaries he's made, this is the one that I keep returning to. And this is basically the story of how advertising tried to falsely convince us that we were actually making decisions between good and evil when we selected Coke or Pepsi. Advertising, it should be the giveaway to you. If you imagine a Facebook not supported by advertising, then you, of course, you've just conjured a business that no longer works. It is the advertising, as described by Adam Curtis, manipulating and turning us into toys, as Merlin Donald described it. That is the century of the self. We do not have to do this anymore. We do not have to pay attention when anybody tries to advertise something to us. In fact, we can adopt the attitude that these people are committing abuse. I joined a group of anthropologists some years ago. The goal here was to reform the field of anthropology, and it attracted quite a group of heterodox anthropologists, one of whom is an American who had moved to Japan to join their advertising industry. So anthropologists, Japanese advertising, there's probably a joke in there someplace, but what he wound up telling me was not very funny. He said, we understand that the entire goal of the advertising industry is to capture the affections of 13-year-old girls. Now, in a normal world, trying to seduce 13-year-olds would be considered child abuse. This is advertising. What you're attempting to do is to implant in the subconscious of 13-year-old girls, because women wind up being the shoppers, not men, brand identification, and other value linkages. As you might imagine, that conversation with a group of anthropologists deteriorated relatively quickly. And then they shut the whole thing down. So I don't know if they passed along the warnings, but if something like this starts again, you'll probably find me somewhere up in the bleachers, eventually raising my hand. Next cover, please. This is the last cover I want to talk about today, and so we'll now have a chance to move to breakout sessions, I hope. This is my old friend, John Markon. John Markon is very well regarded in Silicon Valley. Grew up there, went to Pali High, is often considered to be a hometown boy who made good. He started out, I think, in the South Bay. He wound up at the San Francisco Chronicle. New York Times picked him up. Then I went to Wall Street and I started feeding him ideas, and he was enormously grateful. As you might imagine, Reporters, even reporters at a high level, like the New York Times, are treated like mushrooms. They're kept in the dark and fed manure, and they don't get paid very much money either. So I helped John build his career because I was in the technology industry, and I could connect the dots for him. And so I often gave him story ideas. And some of that actually went on and fed into his Pulitzer contentions and so forth. This is a quite remarkable book in which I am in the acknowledgement for having drawn his attention to what Norbert Wiener really thought about the robots, which he wanted to not put in the book. He wanted to leave all that out, and he wanted to use this title from a 1960s Kenneth Monaghan poem, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, to give you the implication that we really have nothing to worry about with these robots. Well, that may be true, but we do have a lot to worry about from the people who are building the robots. And these are the people today who are the equivalents of Kenneth and Elise Boulding. These are the people who are the equivalents of Tom, who helped to start the well and was defending SRI. These are the equivalents of Fred and all the other people that we've identified here. We now have a very significant grouping of human beings who are trying to go beyond the last 100 years of human engineering to the point of literally engineering something really quite new. That something quite new can be viewed in terms of Kurzweil's singularity, not just Kurzweil, but hundreds of thousands of other people, uploading the human psyche into a machine. That can be viewed in terms of Steve Fuller, who is a sociologist in London, who is a major proponent of robot rights. On Tuesday, there will be a day-long symposium at the University of Lodz in Poland. And this entire conference will be about how we replace humans and how post-humanity is the key idea. One of the speakers is actually a fellow at my center, Alexandra. She will be keynoting, and I will be sitting in the bleachers, eventually raising my hand, I guess. But Stanford University is the headquarters of this activity. Something called Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, condensed to HAI, pronounced HI. John is the resident historian today at Stanford University at HI. He's also the resident historian at the Computer History Museum. He's also working at the Casbah. John and I had a fascinating conversation. We talk a couple of times a year, maybe. And he's been fairly upfront about his concerns about my mistaken views about the world. And so we signed off somewhat humorously in our last conversation. So I get it, Mark. You would actually like there to be a worse world, not a better world. And so it's on that note that I will send you all off into your breakout sessions and very much look forward to the Q&A that follows. Thank you all very much.
Wonderful, folks. Mark, that was amazing. Amazing. Thank you. So we're going to do breakout rooms. So for about 20 minutes where we can discuss these ideas, and then when we come back, you can share your takeaways and questions for Mark.
What we're now observing in terms of cancel culture, in terms of conspiracy theories, QAnon, and so forth, these are all the birth of a new form of pattern recognition. We can complain about how the patterns are not being recognized. I mentioned how Debbie, what in the record industry experienced these things. It's not possible anymore. Many other people have that experience. What we're going through here is a paradigm shift. And the other side of this might be years from now, but things are happening real quick. we're going to have a whole new range of pattern recognition that is crucial and what's needed for us to deal with the robots, which are already everywhere in our lives. Thank you.
Wonderful, folks. So let's keep it to mostly questions because we're only 30 minutes. I want to get as many questions in as possible. Bowden, you're first. Go ahead.
Thank you. It was a marvelous presentation. I like the technology review of manipulation. The underlying question is who funds and commissions and subsidizes all this? And that's very dangerous. You mentioned the Quakers, and that's positive, but there are certain evil forces I wouldn't say that corporations, but they're profit hungry, but there's also maybe some underlying dimensions there that government and even foreign governments can make use of this, like the Chinese government. So that would be a further exploration as to who's behind all this.
Absolutely right, Bodan. That's the pattern recognition which we now have to go through. My answer is the medium is the message.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Maritza, Jean, and Mike. Maritza.
Hi, I have a question. So we're looking at all these books and looking at your essay here. What we're learning is, this is a spectacular failure. This attempt to engineer this better human, it's just an exquisite failure. Okay, I don't disagree with this. And I do have a question about something that you mentioned. And it's, why do we also, or not we, why is it your belief that there's going to be a replacement, or what will be replacing us? Well, you mentioned it'll be better. It will no longer be animal. And then you also say possibly no longer even rational. I'm really curious to hear why you believe it will no longer be rational. I thought that was our saving.
Yes, well, it turns out that rationality rests upon what we are describing as the inner senses. It would be impossible to abstract or develop concepts unless we had first developed percepts, unless we had first cataloged the images that our senses have received, and then we have recognized the patterns. These are the work of the inner senses. So to date, I have had conversations with a number of high level and some not so high level artificial intelligence researchers in the United States, Europe, and in China. And these are some of these include people who get called in to solve the unsolvable problem, that sort of person. They haven't even begun to figure this out. So the artificial intelligences that are now being developed cannot possibly have reason because they do not have the inner senses. If you pattern the human mind on a computer, then you will miss all of this. And what you'll wind up with will be some sort of a fancy computer, but not something that has rationality or reason.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Jean, Mike, Laura, Jade, and Kevin. Jean, what's your question?
Yeah, this is a fascinating presentation. I was wondering, I believe what you said about, robot doesn't really have good or evil. The problem is the person behind the robot. With AI, we could have the possibility of all human don't worry about survival. They're really doing their self-expression, doing art, philosophy, all this. And another possibility, when these people no longer be useful, they could be eliminated, So I just wonder, it's kind of scary what the future will be. Yeah. So I wonder, what do you think? Based on our capitalist system right now, I don't see the possibility people will share their wealth with AI and give everybody self-expression, living their ideal life. It doesn't seem we reached that stage of mind yet.
That's right.
What do you think?
I think we're in for a very exciting next 10 years, is what I think. So what I said in my breakout group is that probably everybody here could identify a golden age that they would like to somehow restore. It might be this or that renaissance. A lot of people seem to be enamored of Rome. I've met many Chinese scholars who think the Tang Dynasty, if we could just somehow get back to the Tang Dynasty, and we've got a Silk Road and everybody brings us presents, and wouldn't that be wonderful? But my answer is today. Exactly as you have posed it. It all depends on the people. And we're right now in the thick of it. And so we now all have an opportunity to recognize patterns that will wind up helping not just ourselves and our families, but more widely. So we're living in a quite remarkable time, is my answer.
Wonderful. Next up is Mike. Mike, question only, please. Mike, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, takes a while to find the unmute key. I love everything you've been doing, and I read the 600 pages or so that you've given us as material, as background. And I think most of us agree in the breakout sessions, and we're on the verge of a new renaissance, or we're on the road to renaissance, to serfdom or worse. What can we do to keep from going crazy in the night? What can we do? One of the things I see is to make sure that the objective function, the goal seeking that the AI works, is to minimize the trauma to society that we've got in this. What in addition to what do you suggest in addition?
Mike, if you take a look, if you find your way to the center's website, you'll find now close to around 30 fellows that we've collected. And one of them is a fascinating fellow. He's the robotics guy on the list. And what you will find if you go and research his work, his view is that we really can't be certain what any algorithm is going to do. And there's been a lot of stuff appearing lately. People have been generating art projects driven by robots, and then the robots wind up doing things that are completely unexpected. So Mr. Yampolsky at the University of Lexington has written a good deal on the topic of AI safety from the standpoint that we can really only trust these things if we, and this is a technical term in AI, if we box them. The term of boxing does not mean punching in the nose in this case, but boxing means you put them in such a situation that they cannot have an effect on society more broadly. But the answer to your question, what can we do? And here I will show my my Catholic colors in answering your question. In addition to the four cardinal virtues, there are many virtues that have been identified over the years. The three cardinal virtues are faith, hope, and charity. Once upon a time, those were names that were given to people, women, particularly when they were born. But my answer, Mike, is that we're all going to have to come to grips with faith, hope, and charity. And of those, charity may wind up being the single most important. And I don't mean universal basic income. I don't mean high taxation, wealth taxes, and so forth. I'm not trying to translate this into a policy expression, but rather our charity for each other as we reorganize ourselves, because the structures are all going to change. As we reorganize ourselves, we must keep charity in the forefront throughout all of that.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Next up is Laura. Laura, what's your question? Laura, you need to unmute yourself.
I think he just answered it in a way. I was wondering how we would ensure equity in this new culture of AI. And I also wanted to know, does he know the work of Ken Cadinger at Carnegie Mellon? Because he does a lot of work with AI and psychology and has for a long time, does a lot of research, so you might be interested.
I do not know Cadinger's work. I will take a look at it. I have probably spent too much time with the Stanford people and the Seattle Allen Institute people and so forth. I need to broaden out and look at what's going on in some other places. So thank you for that, that direction. I will introduce a term here now, which it's unfair to introduce at such a late time in our conversation, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I encourage you to go to Wikipedia and take a look at the term subsidiarity, spelled just the way that it sounds. S-U-B, S-I-D, and all the rest, subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is usually thought of in terms of a famous best-selling book, Small is Beautiful. The principle of subsidiarity says that we should attempt to organize our affairs such that things are handled at the lowest possible level. So, for instance, on Bill Frez's, he's not with us anymore, he's out in California, doing some important family business. It turns out that an article about how the valedictorian of a high school class in Baltimore had a 1.2 grade average or something like that, and how the educational system is failing us. You can also then read about charter schools and so forth, but education may be one of the most important areas here. Why are these families collapsing in Baltimore? I'll be doing some work in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Pick your large industrial town. We all pretty much know the story, and this is what winds up probably more than anything else, our failure. Not only have we failed, Maritza, to re-engineer humanity, we have failed to make society fair for anybody, including the rich people. Just imagine living your life surrounded by bodyguards, having to put on disguises to go out in public, and all the rest. And yes, you're surrounded you've got a gold toilet, and that's gonna make your life somehow worth living. No, I don't think so. So Laura, equity requires a restructuring. And I believe that restructuring requires us to take subsidiarity seriously. And so we're now working on it, but volume 2 of Dianoeticon, we've been working off volume 1, the ecology of the inner senses. Volume 2 will be about the structures of subsidiarity.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next question is from Jade. Jade, what's your question?
So my question is, I've heard about kind of humanoid robots kind of being developed to serve as caregivers in response to COVID. I'm kind of wondering if you know about that, and if you think that COVID and things like that, like our current situation, do you find that people are able to leverage people needing to be distant, people not being able to be places like meat packing plants and things like that in order to push technology forward, because people are more accepting of it, because we got to keep people apart? So replacing people, is it becoming more palatable?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Jade, and I think the answer is yes. COVID has accelerated everything in our lives. And one of those obvious trends was work at home. So a lot of us, my daughter works for a publishing company in Manhattan, and she'd have to get up every day and go to the subway and come into Manhattan and struggle to get into the office to sit in her cubicle. She's probably never going back to that again. An advertising company, a big advertising company that we work with at one of the centers, spinoffs, spoke with them yesterday. They don't think they're going back to their office until next year. Now that has enormous implications, obviously, for the guy running the hot dog stand on the corner, the cab driver who has to ferry these people back and forth. So the acceleration of the divide between people in society is a part of this. The replacing of human beings with machines is a part of this. And so, yes, effectively every trend in our lives, my prediction is that this disintegration of the family will not be tolerated. And what will come out of this will be a radical reexamination of why it is that we don't want to spend time with our parents and our grandparents, and why families don't hang together anymore. And one of the places will be very interesting to see how this works out is in Japan. Japan has led the world in robots taking care of old people. The reason for that, of course, is that the children of the old people don't want that responsibility. The same thing has not happened in China. China is not developing robots. Children aren't still taking care of their parents. So watching how the family deals with end of life and old age issues will be one of the most important ways that I think we can track how we're doing as we come out of this.
Wow. Next up is Kevin, Tom, and Becky. Kevin.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mark. And from the previous experiences, every emerging evolved two directions opposite from the nuclear energy, right? It could be the power us with electricity, also could be weaponized. It's similar to TV, internet, AI. Right. So you mentioned that we about boxing. So who should have that power to box them in? What's the inner sense? It's can we share that inner sense? Right. And further, how can I build a common purpose and principle to serve all human beings? Even further, protect our habitat environment, nature, right, Earth, and other living beings. What's your thought about that? Thank you.
There's a battle now going on between those who are promoting the robots and those who think that they can control the robots, and those who think that they need to regulate the robots. So all of the possible approaches to new technologies that you've mentioned, from beneficial social to shut this thing down to weaponizing, they're all going on in parallel here. As you know, the Chinese government has taken the we can control the robots approach to all of this. And we're not going to allow Jack Ma and people like that to get out in front of us, because we have a new financial system for the world, which will be run by robots. And we're going to run the robot financial system, not Alibaba. India has outlawed a whole number of aspects of this. Most recently, strong encryption, I think, has been federally outlawed in India in this past week or two. So at the same time that we're all sitting here trying to recognize the patterns and what we might do in our lives, we have governments who are acting. One of those governments, the United States government, it is at the point now where the digital sphere, those who are promoting the artificial intelligence robot direction, have effectively taken over the policy, but not just the policy. Policies, of course, are relatively easy to write and ignore, but also the financial levers associated with this. So my answer to your question, Kevin, is that of all the places in the world where people might actually think about boxing AIs, the US is probably at the low end of that scale. And it may very well be that other areas, perhaps with India, or maybe even in an interesting way, Japan, as they think these things through, might wind up at the other end of that spectrum. But very wide range of reactions, which is why, at least I think this is a great time to be alive.
Thank you. Folks, we have 10 minutes left and 3 questions, so keep your questions brief. Next up is going to be Tom, Becky, and Jeff. Tom.
Okay. The thing that worries me the most is that groups planning change, like governments, corporations, and AI scientists, they are extremely good at being vague, full of bullshit, and not really understanding clear purposes. So I don't believe they can even plot to take us over. But what they come up with may be random and dangerous because of their inability to think logically. That was just a statement. Now I have a very short question. You overwhelmed me and a lot of other people with some very interesting stuff. I'm grateful for it. Could you cook it down to one simple idea and one simple thing that we can think about?
Sure. Human beings operate on a subconscious basis, structured around the biases that we develop early in life. We'd better pay a hell of a lot more attention to the biases that we're feeding into the heads of our children, as well as the biases on which we operate our own lives.
Beautiful. Next up is going to be Becky, followed by Jeff. Becky.
Mark, you've mentioned digital sphere a few times. How exactly do you define it? And can you give a little bit more other than that example of Elon Musk in your writing?
In addition to the fact that the digital sphere wants to move to Mars and wants to be handed hundreds of billions of dollars in artificial intelligence funding from the government, I'd say the biggest characteristic of the digital sphere is it's composed of people who have given up on humanity. Regardless, as Tom has absolutely correctly said, they will drape themselves in human-centered technology. They will describe themselves as the greatest defenders of democracy, whatever it is, in order to get past that point of objection. But in fact, none of that is true. None of that is real. The digital sphere no longer believes that that humanity can be fixed. They are the children of the human engineering I discussed today, and they believe that we now have an opportunity to replace humanity with something else, and that is not something that you're likely to get in a interview or a TED talk. You're probably going to have a bottle of bourbon to get to those answers.
Last 2 questions, Jeff and Stefan. Jeff, what's your question?
So thanks so much for this talk. I want to put together 2 things you said, that human beings operate around biases we adopt early in our lives. We should pay great attention to the biases we create. And earlier, the medium, if I understood you correctly, the medium for recognizing patterns to help us determine what we want to do with our lives, maybe individually and together, will be myth. And I wonder how you might fit those 2 together. What would you say?
Very good question, Jeff. The bias that we have grown up in is the mythological bias. That is now being discarded. The mythological bias, that is the sensibility that preceded, if you will, the theoretic culture, as Merlin Donald describes this. And Merlin is correct. The theoretic culture has driven us into a whole series of dead ends. So theoretic culture is not going to be good enough. Unfortunately, the answer of going back to a mythological construction would make things only worse. So we're kind of left in a situation here where we're going to have to retrieve and invent simultaneously. But we're going to have to be aware of what we bring to that discussion. Have to be aware of our mythological tendencies, which are in the imagination, not in the memory category. And as we shift from imagination to memory, we'll have to be very cognizant of exactly what we're doing in our personal lives and in what we think for the rest of society.
Thank you. Last question from Stefan. Stefan, what's your question?
So Mark, I was wondering, do you see any signs of the powers that be, such as government bodies or these big corporations, constructing any sort of AI programs that police the information that we put onto the internet?
Well, I will take the opportunity to spend 1 minute with my rant against the idea of information. There is no such thing as information. Information is a very deliberate dodge of forms. Information is just the word form with a prefix and a suffix. And in that, the form is being hidden. So my concern is not about information on the internet. My concern is with the forms that are being presented on the internet. And in order for us to deal with the underlying problem, there's no degree of censorship. There are no robots that can figure out at Facebook how to get around people, making jokes and making other references. The Chinese have figured this out already. People can talk about whatever they want on the Chinese internet. They just invent new words or talk about things in a somewhat hidden fashion. I'll recommend for you Leo Strauss's Persecution and the Art of Writing in this regard. People will always figure out a way to talk about things and communicate with each other. So there is no robot answer to the information on the internet. But my hope is that there will become an answer to the forms, the structures, the social relationships which are presented. And this is not going to be something which a robot is going to be able to solve. It'll have to be the humans on the internet who then engage with the forms that are being presented. This brings us back to biases. It brings us back to media environments. But it really is our strength. It is the pattern recognition of forms that distinguishes human beings from all other animals. Yes, we have a rational capability, which is a critical part of that, but it is of a combination of a subconscious and a conscious activity, which we are going to have to get a lot better at. And I think it's quite possible we will have another chance to come and talk about some of this. I saw somebody suggest that when we get some of our work done on subsidiarity, we might come back. I have a great deal of affection for this group that has assembled here. We started out with around 75 people. We wound up with a hardcore of about 25. That is exactly the way it should work. So I want to thank you all for sticking with these conversations. And I look forward to my next opportunity to talk to you all individually or as a group.
Wonderful. Mark, this was a tremendous honor, and this was an incredibly powerful presentation. So thank you very much. Thank you.